Welcome to another episode of the Furrows podcast. My name is Ryan Klopak, and I'm joined here by Alex Julian. And this is the Furrows, a podcast where we talk to people who have been transformed by classical education and who are taking on that flame, that mantle of leadership, and transforming others through that same means. Today we have a really exciting guest on. I'm going to have Alex actually introduce him a little bit more. Alex, who do we have on today?
Yeah, we're bringing in John Mueller from the Houston area, and I got to meet John through some of our work in placing him at a classical institution from another classical institution, and I also got to meet him at a conference that we were at Belmont Abbey this past fall, and dig into his story, and just such a wonderful man with a wonderful story. And so wanted to have him on the podcast to share that today.
So John, tell us a little bit about your experience and who you were prior to jumping into classical education in whatever form that means to you.
Great. Well, thank you both, Alex and Ryan, for having me on. It's a pleasure to get a chance to talk more with you guys. I've enjoyed that in the past. So, it's hard to say a kind of before and after classical education for me. I think I can divide it out into a few different stages. And so the reason that it's difficult is I think I was raised classically in an important sense. So I was homeschooled K through sixth grade. And a lot of what, would be intelligible to a classical homeschooling environment now was how my mom and dad tried to raise me. My mom's a teacher before homeschooling. My sisters and I have three sisters, only boy with three sisters, which I thought of as a curse when I was little. And now is a great blessing. So my mom's a teacher, my dad's a pastor in the Presbyterian church. So many gifts, present in both parents as far as deep engagement with text, careful attention to not just thinking well, but then also living out your life in a way that matched what you believed. But I think it would be fair to say that I had a kind of elevated classical education encounter for the first time as a student, more towards my ninth grade year. And that's where I went to what was kind of properly termed a classical school for the first time. And there was a wonderful teacher there, right? I mean, I think many of us have this in our background where there's a particular teacher that changes how we look at what's possible when it comes to how texts impact my life, right? And so that teacher was the first one that I remember reading any Platonic dialogue with. And we were reading the Euthyphro, and of course we get to the Euthyphro dilemma, and we're discussing that. And it was like, a light went on in a dark place, even having been raised, like I said, by thoughtful, devout parents, that just the formulation in a discussion environment of that question that comes from the Euthyphro, whether something is holy because it is dear to the gods or whether it's dear to the gods because it's holy. It just set me back, on my feet. And I realized, I haven't been thinking this way. I haven't been, really, and I think it's appropriate, right? Maybe before ninth grade, it doesn't even occur to you that such questions can be asked necessarily. And so that was a good time for it. And another thing that I'll probably come back to is that teacher actually he left the school after that year. And the school itself kind of meandered after that year and kind of moved away from classical. And so my parents knew what a strong connection I had had with that teacher, and sort of continued just kind of there was a small group literature class that this teacher offered. And we read the Divine Comedy. We read more Plato. And we read George MacDonald. We read The Golden Key and Phantastes, which has turned out to be very important in my life. And so there was that setting. And then I ended up being in community college for the remainder of high school. Because like I said, the school I had been attending stopped offering classes. My parents, I think, rightly intuited that I was maybe not going to do well just being fully back in homeschool. But it was an odd arrangement. I was enrolled completely in community college classes for the remainder of my high school career, which did mean that by the time I was 18 and I graduated from high school, I also had my AA. I had 70 odd units of college credit. But I had a really jaded and cynical view of, I would say, many things. I mean, teenagers often do. But I had a jaded view of what was available in terms of college, right? I had been at a community college. Now, I had some really great professors there. But I kind of also, and maybe this is in part just hubris, but I think it was in part because of the environment where I was. I kind of had this thought by the time I was 17, 18, well, if this is what college is, I don't know that I want to go do more of it. And so I also had been kind of drifting in an interior way, in as far as my Christian faith went, through high school. And I kept that fairly private. I never stopped attending church. I never rebelled and rejected the faith of my parents. I've always had a good relationship with my parents, even when I felt like this was something I couldn't share with them as completely as I wanted to, as completely as I could tell they wanted me to. But definitely in my soul, I felt unmoored. I felt like I was drifting. It's strange how these things happen, but a professor at the community college who I think was not a Christian, maybe not any particular religion, kind of just a consumer in a way, as far as world religions, but a careful thinker and a lover of great literature. He put the Tao Te Ching in front of me and said, read this, you'll enjoy it. And oddly enough, at a time when, there was kind of deep cynicism in my soul and dabbling with, existential philosophy, nihilism of, various stripes, as you do when you're a teenager. But I was earnest. I was earnestly seeking through. Yeah,
earnest nihilist.
What was that? An
earnest nihilist.
Yeah, I wanted to know the truth, and if I hadn't been believing the truth, I wanted to confront that. But strangely, the Tao Te Ching, I think in part because it was so unfamiliar and from such a separate tradition than the one I had been raised in, turned out to be really important because it, while in completely unfamiliar terms, certainly to me at that point, it emphasizes the eternal persistence and consistency of the way, right? Tao in Chinese means way. And there is the path that characterizes virtue. There is the way that good men and women are. There is the way of heaven and the way of earth, right? And there was something that just, I mean, I don't know if you've read it before, but in the first saying, it begins, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The Tao that can be named is not the eternal name. And that just also knocked my socks off, because I realized like so much of what I was doing when I said, I don't know if I believe in God or the picture of things that I've been given, I was not talking about the eternal thing as it is. I was talking about my conception of the eternal thing. And those are really different. Mm-hmm. And that was I received that lesson, at around 17 in a really humbling way. And that was good for me because, it's taken me years. I would say I'm still unpacking the implications of that lesson, but the lesson that I had made a kind of hubristic mistake of like thinking that I had comprehended something just by talking about it, by being able to talk about it. That had been a huge error. Right. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's really interesting how that last point, especially what you're talking about with the argument that you had been having all along was your conception of who God is or what reality is. And that had been the thing that needed to be challenged, not reality itself necessarily.
Right.
And it's a discovery that I had the wrong image, and then learning to reimagine God around this new image that you're slowly discovering over time. I don't know if that's something that a lot of people are aware of, that a lot of the arguments that they're having are with that internalized image of who God is or what I imagine him to be. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about what was the image that you had as a child, and why was it insufficient for you as you got older?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, because I think a lot of times people do have this experience and they attribute it to, like, let's say that they're raised, Protestant and they become Catholic, or the Protestant, they become Orthodox or something like that. Or vice versa. Though I think that happens less in this country, though not in other countries necessarily. But I feel uncomfortable. So, to be fair, I was raised Presbyterian. I'm Anglican, so I'm not exactly in the same tradition I was raised in. But I'm hesitant even to say there was something insufficient about, like, the theology of the tradition I was raised in part because I know that what I really registered at this point was, when I was 17, was that I had an inferior view myself, right? Like, it wasn't just that, my specific community or tradition or the people I spend time with have an insufficient view. Like, I have an insufficient view. I have not been, when I talk about God, I've been talking about my idea of God, not the eternal God, right? Like, it's that language from the Tao helped me. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Like, when you are talking about it, you have to recognize that it's separate from the eternal thing that exists independently of you. And you might have some way towards it, some way to participate, but it is not itself what you are saying it is right now in this moment.
Were there some theological, was there some theological images for you that you didn't feel like matched up with the reality you were experiencing at 17 or as a teenager? Yeah. Where, the reason I'm asking that is you have such an interesting journey compared to a lot of the people that we talk to, where you start out being homeschooled, you start out doing classical, and then you go into basically like public community college, like at 15.
Yeah.
And so you're in the reverse. You know, we have a lot of people, it's like public school to classical school, there's a conversion. You go from like this Euthyphro moment in ninth grade and then having this reading group to, and then there's this quote higher mode of education that you're experiencing as a teenager, you know, that most other people aren't experiencing at your age. So it's like, oh, here's this next thing that's being offered to me, and it seems worse than the thing I was doing. So that's why I'm asking, like, did where you were in school, where you were in life, was that starting to not match up, and your view of the world starting to not match up with your conception of God?
Yeah, I think a couple of things on that point. There in the Presbyterian tradition that I was raised in, you know, there is robust systematic theology, right? And I think I thought I was well enough versed in that. I surely wasn't at that point, but I didn't feel that it was expansive enough. And this is maybe the not so great side of me reading the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita and so forth for the first time when I was a teenager. I think if you track it down, this turns out to be a common experience. So like that early phase where you read these other like major texts from world religions, where the reader, me, sort of thinks like, oh, there must be more going on than I had previously thought, because look at this, you know. And so it wasn't that I had the experience that, oh, that means the God of Christianity is false. I just had a sense that the way I've been thinking about God, maybe the way I've been used to talking about God in church, isn't sufficient given what else I want to know. Like, I want to know how Lao Tzu, you know, the writer of the Tao Te Ching, could have this idea of the eternal Tao and really seem to be right about that, right? In a way
and not be in a Christian tradition.
And in fact, you know, like way before a Christian tradition.
Right.
And not even, you know, as with Plato, I mean, there's sometimes the question of like, did Plato, you know, who's writing near enough to the time of Lao Tzu, you know, maybe 100 years different. Did Plato make it to Egypt or some other part of the Mediterranean at some point where the Hebraic texts were, and he sort of read Genesis, and that's how we got to Timaeus? Like, you know, there's that line of thought. I don't think that has to be true. I think there's good reason to think that he's operating from some other traditions there. But yeah, so I think, as I said, I was earnest and foolish, but also I was there was the right impulse to want to track things down, right? But the foolishness came with the sort of like small conclusions you make along the way of trying to, the worthy goal of tracking down, like, what is at the bottom of everything? What is the truth? Like, what is going on when it comes to this thing many traditions call God, and is there a way for me to understand God within the Christian tradition in a way that I can also like hear Lao Tzu as making some sense, like not saying the same thing, not trying to be syncretistic here, but as if he is saying the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao, I think he's making sense and he's saying something true. And I want to follow that through. Right. That was kind of where I was. And I probably, you know, over the years, I've gone on to talk with my dad about these things and with, of course, many other Christian teachers, and, you know, have discovered that they're willing to have those conversations. I think at the time I felt like no one will want to talk about this with me because it seems outside the bounds, right? It's not John Calvin, it's not Augustine, and so I probably wrongfully assumed at many points also that those conversations couldn't be had, which then increased my sense interiorly of isolation. Right.
Man, there's so much good stuff here. Like, I don't even know where to go next, because there's so many things that we could talk about and unpack. So I think where I want to go next is the Euthyphro.
Yeah.
Because I just can't resist. So yeah, let's spend a little bit of time with ninth grade John, and we'll go back to seventh grade John beyond, or 17-year-old John beyond. So,
and 17-year-old John does go to college, which is part of the re-enchantment to education and classical education story. But we can get there.
Right. Yeah. We can see a great finished product in front of, very many respectable books and clothing, but how do we get there? So the Euthyphro. I mean, when you're talking about even the Tao and then shifting over to Socrates, I mean, Euthyphro for me was this gateway drug into the idea that there's truth. Mm-hmm. I was kind of in my own perversion.
What is Euthyphro? Like, talk about that more for our audience that may not be familiar.
Yeah, so that's good. So, Euthyphro is the first dialogue in this grouping of 5 dialogues that is often read when people are introduced to Plato. It's not chronologically the first, but it's just a really great intro to Plato, because it takes place when he's on his way to being tried by the Athenian state for corrupting the youth, and then ultimately is made to drink the hemlock and all of that. So the Euthyphro is a discussion between Socrates and Euthyphro about what piety is, because Euthyphro is basically meets Socrates on the road to his trial and says, "Oh yeah, I was just in the courthouse. I was prosecuting my father for impiety." And so, Socrates, like, I'm sure if it was a cartoon, he'd like screech in his tracks on his way to the trial, and was like, "Oh, okay, we need to talk about this. Like, you must be you must have a great understanding of piety to do something so bold as to prosecute your own father for impiety." Right. And then they have this discussion about piety. So that's kind of the intro, but and then like in many of the dialogues, Plato and Euthyphro kind of go through this systematic definition, and then counter argument, and then a new definition, and then another counter argument, trying to find the truth. That for me was this clear understanding that truth is something you can pursue, and it's certainly, when you make a claim, there are ways to measure it, as though how logical it is, how reasonable it is. But yeah, I'm just curious what you're like digging into that. You're talking a little bit about holiness and the gods. Like, what really struck you there? And did you bring any of that along with you, even though your classical experience kind of fell apart for a few years?
Yeah, I think it was, this is going to sound maybe ridiculously simple. It was the formulation of that key question from the text that, more so than the subject matter of piety, just the, as you mentioned, the systematic way that, it's kind of a paradigmatic Socratic dialogue, right? Where Socrates works through the different offerings by Euthyphro, helps Euthyphro realize that they're insufficient. Well, Euthyphro doesn't, in fact, realize. Euthyphro gets frustrated enough that he can't defend any particular premise, but he doesn't admit that he's been wrong. He goes merrily on his way, thinking, "Yep, I'm going to keep prosecuting my father." But it was, so one, I think just the thrill of the dialectic, like playing out in that dialogue, in kind of the first time that I was looking at it that way of, a truth-oriented conversation where they were really going to get to the bottom of something. And it turns out they didn't really get to the bottom of something, but they got to the bottom of realizing what a problem they had on their hands. And that's important, right? It's kind of like Elizabeth Anscombe says, want to work on it from scratch, and it takes a long time to get to scratch. Realizing how much there is in a question like that, I found really exciting, but just the phrasing of the key question, of what makes something pious, just in those kind of pure philosophical terms, I found really compelling, and realizing, okay, if you get a question like this, you can really be off to the races on something important. And if you learn how to discuss the way that Socrates knows how to discuss, that's a new mode. Like I was just not thinking or discussing that way before. And so I think I had been very well taught before ninth grade, as far as like the books that I put in front of me, and the classes that I had both at home and, a co-op here and there. But just that, like participating in the dialectic that way, that was a new mode for me. And so I think maybe that's an underwhelming answer, Alex, but that really is the answer to what excited me about the dialogue so much.
No, it's great. I mean, now there's so many places we can go from here because, when you look at classical homeschooling, and of course we want to, I don't have a lot of experience with that. I want to be respectful and honoring to all of the parents who take that on. I mean, that's a huge undertaking. But what I'm seeing, one of the threads of what kind of shocks students awake about classical is that there's these adults who are willing to challenge the children's assumptions while they're challenging their own assumptions as adults, and that they're going through this, Socratic irony of constantly like having, the way I see it is this: you have so much faith in the truth that you're willing to test it over and over again. Yeah. It's not a lack of faith that you're testing the truth. It's that this is a standard. And so, this is a tuning fork. And so I'm going to hit the tuning fork over and over again. Mm-hmm. And that sometimes in the homeschool space or in the Christian ed space mm-hmm. or whatever, it kind of is taught almost as fragile.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Like, look, you have got to make this so internal to yourself. And the students kind of then feel like, gosh, can it not be tested? Can we not? Mm-hmm. What if we assumed it's not true? What would happen then? Right. Could it stand up to that sort mm-hmm. of scrutiny? And the beautiful thing I think I see about the classical education mode is, because you believe in the truth so much, assuming it's not true just makes it that much stronger when you you don't fail to pursue.
Yeah. So is that the piece I was missing before, that your conception of God had never been tested, and now you found that there is a way to test whether or not something is true, and you can be certain with a particular conclusion that derives from those questions?
Yeah, I think maybe that's a helpful way of putting it, that it's one thing to build something, it's another thing to test something, right? And so my conception of God, my own faith, had been built, but not tested in the way that perhaps I was desirous of. I wanted, and I think a lot of contemporary Christianity of various traditions, a lot of Christian schooling circles, but honestly, outside of Christianity as well. But I'd like to just pick on my own group. That's more fair. But I don't think this is an exclusive claim. Is the the framework of the group is treated more as fragile. Alex, to your point, like, we've got to really think just this, and then we'll be safe, right? This is how we know we're right. Yeah. And I felt, even if people weren't saying that to me directly, I felt that sense often. And I wanted to just really test, and I wanted to like go to the hilt and find out if it was true. And I think, I came to understand that better. I mean, sometimes that can be a destructive impulse, but often it's the healthy one that we see Socrates model in a dialogue where, like in the Phaedrus or, Phaedrus might be the example that I'm thinking of right here. Yeah. Where he says, to say what the soul really is, my dear Phaedrus, is a task fit for the gods alone. Or maybe if we had more time, a mortal man could do it. But such as it is, to say what it is like, that's a task that we can pursue, right? So I don't want to try to encompass the whole thing. I want to say maybe I could speak analogically for a moment and get closer, right? But that sort of demands that you be willing to keep, striking the tuner and saying, did this match? Like, was that it? Right? Tell me again from the beginning, what do you say virtue is? Socrates' question to Meno, after they've already been talking for pages and pages about what virtue is. And that demand that the teacher be willing to enter into that inquiry as well. I think that was something that I saw in the Socratic dialogues and then later in college as well.
Yeah, I don't think that's a specific problem tied to any one denomination as far as being given a conception of the faith or the paradigm, but being too afraid to actually test it because either the teacher or the students haven't been well coached in how to explore inquiry in such a way where we can feel like we actually are getting somewhere and we have some concrete understanding of a thing that we're trying to study. I think that's universally applicable. And when I think about all the people that I know who have left the Christian faith, it's because either life itself or someone that they met or some class they had in college posed a question that they didn't know how to answer. And then they just sat there with that question, and that question dominated them, and it ate them. And at no point did they ever feel like they had the power to fight back with it. So it really is not enough to just give the story, the felt board animation of like, what is our faith? The indoctrination, I guess you would call it, where you're just cramming a worldview without putting it under scrutiny. You have to be able to flex those intellectual muscles to see if it stands up, because it is just inevitable that we're going to encounter something that doesn't fit the paradigm that we grew up with.
Yeah.
And we have to make some sort of reconciliation of like, does this actually fit under the umbrella that I have been given?
And this is, I think that's right. And this is such a hard thing, right, for parents and teachers, especially of small children. So I have 4 kids, all between the ages of 2 and 9. And this is something I think about, and we can go outside of a Christian context for a moment to find, Plato, for instance, suggests, or Socrates suggests in Republic that, don't have people engage in dialectic till they're about 30. And that's just an interesting, it's because in the educational framework that he's building in the Republic, music and gymnastic, by which we should also hear like games, and folk tales and poetry, that's what they should be doing through high school, basically, music and gymnastic, and then some arithmetic, but not too much, not till later, right? But dialectic, no, don't do it till you're about 30. And so it's just interesting, like given that Plato thought that, and he's, he doesn't have the same concerns that, either Christian parents have in that regard of like at least the felt board kind of motif you were talking about just now. But this idea that it really is appropriate to just give story and cultivate wonder at especially those early ages. And if you do cultivate wonder, don't do it in so rigorous a way that you destroy the ability to inhabit a particular world, right? I think about this with my 9-year-old. She loves to what she calls do a philosophy with me, and we'll just like sit at the breakfast table and ask like, what is a number? What are things like that? And so I want to have those discussions with her, provided that she's interested. But I also am careful in those to not be so rigorous that she ends up feeling like nothing can be said, right? Nothing is sure, right? Because that's a bad outcome of the dialectic sort of indiscriminately applied, I think.
Yeah, that's really important because, another piece about this mode of education that we're, so big on and, so seeking stories of transformation around is that when students are younger, there's this really delicate dance of creating an environment that is beautiful, that's good, that's uplifting, giving them real heroes to believe in, right? Giving them all these beautiful examples, but then also giving them the trust again that truth is there, even if it's not fully formed, that there's kind of sensing intellect in them that can pick up on when something's not quite right, and exploring that, and like, and that's why there's images of evil constantly in even the fairy tales, as a perversion of the good. So yeah, just how did that maybe connect? How does that either connect with, that you have kids now, or looking back to being raised the way that you were? Were there any kind of strong foundations being laid in that way that you were able to return to, or that you're returning to with your kids?
Yes. Wow. That's a good question. So I think, the foundations that were laid, oftentimes, I mean, there were theological foundations laid. As I said, my dad's a pastor, so there's even when I wanted to escape the theological foundations, there was no escape. And now I'm thankful, but you're not always thankful for that when you're 12, 15. But the habits of prayer and scripture reading that my parents cultivated in the home, but also time spent reading together things outside of scripture. My mom read so much to us because she was our primary teacher for so many years. But then, and so I remember her reading Chronicles of Narnia to us. I remember my dad reading The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings to us. And so those are things that I've tried to take forward with my kids. And, it's that time of year. So including the Father Christmas letters that Tolkien wrote. And so we're reading those now. But also, I was raised in a tradition where, the kind of Trinity hymnal was always ready to hand. And I'm thankful for the hymns that are still kind of word for word in my mind, even when I haven't sung them in my particular tradition in quite some time. We'll go back home and visit my parents' church, and I'll find that I can sing, all of great is thy faithfulness, or how firm a foundation, without looking at the hymnal, just because of being raised that way. And that's that's a great gift too, that I can't underestimate, being raised with a prioritization of memory work. And also just the fact that when you really do have those habits in the home of psalm reading, scripture reading, and singing hymns, those things become deep memory, even when they're not being pitched as like memorization work. I at no point did my parents say, now you're going to memorize this hymn, right? The way you memorize a hymn that stays in there pretty much your whole life is to sing it many, many weeks out of the first, 20 years of your life, and then you have it. So that's something I think about with my own kids too. I sort of, with my children and my students, I've thought of it as kind of like I know this is going to sound very dark, but like the concentration camp education. Like if you were shipped off to a concentration camp, do you have an education that couldn't be taken away from you? Do you have something that couldn't be taken away because, they can take your books, they can take, of course, your computer and all your tech, they can take away Google, your access to, we have more at our fingertips than ever. And yet we have this sense that we maybe are less familiar with the things that we should be. So what do you have that can't be taken away from you? Is a question I think a lot about when it comes to memory work and education.
That's so good. That's such a great way.
I want to go down that road, and I'm worried about hijacking off the story. My God.
So, I'd love to go down that road. Of course, with all of our guests, we're starting to say like, okay, part 2. Yeah. We got to do a part 2.
And 3 and 4.
Yeah. So we'll save that for part 2. With the last kind of 20 minutes here, I really want to dig into, okay, so, I know you went overseas for a while.
Yeah.
And then there was kind of like a providential moment where you returned. So can you tell us about that? And then I'd also then love to kind of end with where were you able to give back to your students, and how are you forming, people now with the tradition that you return to? So 17-year-old John doesn't want to have anything to do with college because he thinks it's rubbish. And then I think you go overseas. Can you let's go there?
Yeah. So 17-year-old John doesn't want to have anything to do with college, thinks it's rubbish. And so I decided, okay, I finish, I would graduate, but then I would work, and I had it in my head that I wanted to travel. I just didn't know where, or what for. I just wanted to go. And
is that the Took side of you?
Yeah. Definitely was there. And so I did. I graduated high school, and then I worked for basically a year. I worked construction, and I waited tables, and saved up enough money for traveling. And in the meantime, found an avenue to do it. My dad actually suggested that I reach out to a missionary family in the Czech Republic that was connected with our denomination. And I thought, like, no, I don't want to do that. I didn't feel like I could authentically, pitch in with missionaries because I felt confused,
Sure.
And my dad, the more, when you get older, you realize like your parents are sometimes playing the long game. And my dad was like, just talk to him. And, he's not going to make you like do anything you don't want to do. Just find out what's going on over there. And so I wrote to this missionary pastor, and I was like, hello, I would like to come live in the Czech Republic with you. And so back on it. And I was like, I don't speak Czech, but if you need help teaching English or building things, I feel like I could do either of those things, because I had been working in construction. And it's just like the dumbest proposal letter of all time. But they took me up on it. God bless them. And so I saved up money and then went overseas for about 4 months total. 3 of those months were in the Czech Republic. And I flew into Paris because I had a friend there. And so I stayed in Paris for a week and then took a bus over to Prague, stayed there for 3 months, and then spent about 3 weeks doing like the Eurail pass, where you can, if you buy the Eurail pass, you can get on basically any train in Europe. So I did that for 3 weeks on the way back. And it was it's kind of an endlessly important period in my life, where so many things that I had been sort of sensing about maybe the importance of, I always loved history. So the importance of history, but the importance of tradition, but also the importance of beauty. When you grow up, I grew up in California, so there's lots of natural beauty. In a way I was reminded of, I just visited, took my family to see my parents and my wife's parents over Thanksgiving break, and, stood there on the shore watching the sunset over the Pacific Ocean and just thought, whoa, why would anyone ever leave here? It's so beautiful, but cultural beauty, and beauty in architecture and so forth, that's not really something I had access to, especially in that historical sense. Right. And so when you go to Paris and Prague and some of the cities in Germany that I went to, the medieval town, Rothenburg, it's just, it's a new kind of experience, a new engagement with beauty and tradition and history that I had not had before. And also working closely with a missionary family, and seeing the care that they provided for their church and their community in the Czech Republic. I mean, it was such an interesting thing to engage with that culture, because I had no knowledge of the Czech Republic before that. It's just at this very interesting sort of juncture between Eastern Europe and Western Europe, and there's an Orthodox tradition there, there's a Catholic tradition there, there's a strong Protestant tradition there because of Jan Hus, and so just this like collision of worlds, and then also the fact that Prague had been under communism and behind the Iron Curtain, and the effects of that were still very evident, right? And a high rate of atheism, despite such a rich religious tradition, Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant. And so it was just really, really amazing to engage with that culture and to find, like, what did this group that I was having this encounter with want? Oftentimes they didn't actually want to talk much about Christianity, except for the people who were in that small missionary church. But, the people who would come to English classes didn't want Christianity, but they did want English. And so that was kind of, though I say it with some chagrin, that was kind of perfect for me, because I was like, well, I don't feel like I want to talk with you about Christianity either, but I can talk with you about English. And, but I also then found, over the course of my time there, that I found myself wanting to talk with people about Christianity, because to start out with, I thought, okay, totally, let's just do English. But then hearing them talk about their lives, I was working with people who are not too far from my own age. Like, I was kind of the youth group leader for a while, but it was not youth group. It was just like they would have them over to play games and watch a movie, but it wasn't a Bible study, right? Because I think the idea was that the kids wouldn't have come. But I was only 18 and these kids were all 16, 17, 18. And so did a lot of ultimate Frisbee, but then the more time I spent talking with them and the more, I would get to know them and hear their kind of devout atheism, the more I had the impulse internally of, well, no, that's not right either. Come on. Like, have you thought about X, right? And finding that, you know, what you often, when you're in a Christian context, like sort of a saturated Christian context, you sort of feel like a bit more cavalier about atheism. But when you see it more directly impacting people's lives and creating a state of more like internal and spiritual impoverishment, then you realize like, well, no, somebody should bring this up right now. Okay, fine, I'll do it.
I think there's a Flannery O'Connor story about this.
Yeah.
Like when you're confronted with true atheism or true nihilism, it gets scary really fast, and your fake leg gets stolen.
Wow, that's really interesting, because usually when I hear about the challenge to the paradigm, I think of like the seductive quality of the strange worldview that you could be lured into, but you're seeing it totally having lived out the real implications of it and eating the fruits of real life atheism, and you're seeing the terror and the horror behind it. Could you talk a little bit more about what were some of the things that surprised you that were just completely absent from their worldview, that you felt the need to rush in and fill with a better story?
Yeah. The idea of the possibility that there could be a good and loving God. And I've been really compelled, you know, I referenced reading Phantastes for the first time in early high school. But, you know, Anodos, the main character in Phantastes, makes so many mistakes. I feel like he's a very sympathetic character for me. But he makes so many mistakes in part because he's so earnest and he loves beauty. And, you know, without like going into everything in the story, you know, he, after a series of utterly destructive failures at some points, he is able to say by the end of the novel, yet I know that good is coming to me, that good is always coming, though few have at all times the courage and simplicity to believe it. And that line has stuck with me forever, and I think it will, as long as I have memory, that, you know, that good is always coming. And I felt somehow strangely compelled, like I believed that in my teenage years, even if I didn't feel like I could say I believed everything that I had been raised with in the Christian faith, that I could say exactly what kind of Christian I was. Somehow that line broke through. And so when I was encountered with, you know, because there was nothing seductive or fascinating about the atheism of the kids I met in the Czech Republic, because they hadn't done it to themselves. They hadn't found like the cool, rebellious way to be atheists. They were just raised in that kind of spiritual desolation, right? And so it was very boring. It was and you know, I think they felt like it was uninteresting, but they also felt like, well, we also mock Christians because who's going to believe in the guy in the sky, right? But there was no like awesome alternative for them either. And it led to a kind of, sense of being sort of metaphysically unmoored and a listlessness for them, that I think when I saw it and started to perceive clearly what was at the root, I wanted to be able to say, but good is coming. And I don't know how I can explain that yet, but trust me. And then I realized I was going to have to get much better at finding the account for that.
That's great. All right. Well, there's so much more to talk about there. We could stay in your experience in Europe for the rest of the time. But yeah, just briefly, where we probably should have spent most of the time was Torrey Honors College.
Yeah.
But that's for part 2. So briefly, what shifted for you there? And then what do you feel like you were most equipped to bring to young people after that experience?
Yeah. After the experience of Torrey,
Yeah.
So I was in Europe when I found out about Torrey's existence, right? And the idea that there was a great books program out there that was kind of like the stripped down, like just the good stuff version of college. And I was immediately sold, in part because, there I was in the middle of Europe with this beauty and tradition and history all around me for the first time. And I just thought, okay, this is connected to, that reading of Phantastes, that reading of Plato and Dante and Shakespeare and other things that I had had a glimpse of. But this, where I'm standing right now, that's connected to those texts. And Torrey is at least saying that it's going to be more of that, right? It's going to help me engage with this tradition that I am surrounded by right now and that I find that I love so much. And yes, it sounds like it's doing the things that I've found myself wanting, during the high school years at community college, that I wished college would do, but that I was finding that it wasn't doing. We were going to be in groups of 14 to 16, sitting in front of Plato and Augustine and Aquinas and Shakespeare and Calvin, and just digging in. And that's what I want. And so I applied to Torrey from the Czech Republic. I had my interview on Skype, which was very dicey in those days. But it worked out. Had the interview with Paul Spears, and was accepted to the program, and then went there very soon after I returned to the country. And so, I was an English major and in the Torrey Honors Institute there, and that was just an excellent pairing for me. They still had an English track at that time, where with Dr. Aaron Kleist, I was able to learn Anglo-Saxon and work on translating Beowulf, in addition to doing like the Shakespeare classes and things like that. But then this important strain all throughout of the great books experience at Torrey was just immensely formative for me. And I knew, I had that experience teaching English in the Czech Republic. And I came out on the other side of Torrey thinking, okay, I actually really loved teaching English. That was surprising to me. But if I can teach great books, that's what I want to do. Like that experience of teaching that I had had before, if I can do that with these books and help young people grapple with some of the things I know I was grappling with as a junior high and high school aged person, if I can help them do that in a way that, one, equips them for the things that they need to be equipped for, but also gives them hope that good is coming, right? That because we need to be ready to confront like the most difficult things. This goes back to our building versus testing. You get to a point when you realize, God forbid, but we know from history that at some point the concentration camp does come, right? Or the disaster comes, the thing that you really had hoped wouldn't happen. How can an education that grapples with eternal things help you be ready for that? That's what I wanted to do with young people.
Yeah, I think when you keep talking about waiting for a disaster to strike, I think you're talking about the need to prepare people for death.
Yeah.
Because that is the thing that comes for everyone. The concentration camp may not,
right.
But like you even see this with people who have Alzheimer's, who are in the process of dying, and all is being stripped away from them, their money, their health, their memory.
Yeah.
Yet somehow there's still something alive and active in them that when they hear a certain song or hear a certain story, see memory come back to life and revivified. And it's kind of a long game we're playing in a question of what is going to bring us back to life. I mean, in a way, it's almost like, are we priming ourselves for a resurrection?
Yeah.
Because death is coming.
Right. Yeah.
And so how do we spend our hours doing that? Well, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I was just going to echo your point that, Socrates says this in the Phaedo, that philosophy is nothing other than the preparation for death, or training for death, depending on how you translate it. He uses this phrase "melete thanatu," which melete is like this. Think like Olympic yard training. So training for death. That's what a good education should be doing, because the stakes are high.
I think that's so good and such a great place to end it. But just your analogy earlier of what can they not take from you? I mean, it's really only the things that are in your soul, right, that can't be taken away. And so how is that not also then preparation for death? And I don't think it's ever been more obvious that that's the sort of education that human beings need when all sorts of forces in this world are willing to take knowledge and you're able to just give your knowledge over to that thing. Give your responsibility of knowing over to the phone or the internet or the AI. And it's like, well, then what's in your soul? Forget about even being in the marketplace. Like, who are you if you give up all of those things? And man, what a great existential question to end this episode with. So, John, thank you so much for giving us your time. You're busy, and we really hope we get a part 2 with you.
Yeah.
We have to get a part 2 with you. Yeah.
I would love that. Yeah. So just let me know. But thanks again. I enjoyed the conversation.